All right, guys and girls, we left off here looking at slave labor and the impact of industrialization on both the North and the South. Now, you remember the North was much more industrialized, it had a much more deep industrial base and the infrastructure to go along with it, like roads, trains, steam engines, all that stuff. The South did not. The South was agrarian, rural, and really was not as urban as the North. The idea of slave labor now comes into question both politically and morally across the United States. If you look at this map, this is America in 1819, okay? 1 year before the Missouri Compromise. So all of these pink areas here are states, okay? They have met the conditions for statehood. They all have their own constitution and all that stuff. Now, this area right here is not a state yet, okay? Florida is still controlled by Spain, and these are all territories that came with the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. You notice Minnesota, here's the Mississippi River, okay, as it goes down the border there. We're all up here in that, in the Missouri Territory. Now, you're a territory until you meet a couple conditions. One is population requirement. Two is some kind of governmental organization. And then once you've reached those certain number of people and you have formed a government, you write a constitution, you apply for statehood. So we have no states really west of the Mississippi besides Louisiana. Okay, again, Florida is not part of this. People now are moving into these territories as time goes on since the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. Okay, now as people move, they apply for statehood, and the idea of extending slavery now expands into this area of the country. And the question becomes, what are we going to do? Are we going to allow slavery in the country as a whole in any of these territories? Are we going to let people decide? What's the issue going to be? And it all comes to a head in a state that's right in here, which now is Missouri. Okay. So again, if you count the states, there are 11 free and 11 slave. So you got 11 in the North, 11 in the South. Now, slavery has not been in the North for some time, but it used to be there. Okay. Any additional state now, if you just add one, is going to shift the power, not even in the Senate, but in Congress, okay? In Congress. So what does that mean? Well, if you're voting as a block, either in the North or the South, you want to have as many votes as possible, okay? And if there's a free state added in the North, that means the South is going to be at a disadvantage, and they're not going to be able to get their legislation passed. They're going to be at really a power downfall. Same thing if a slave state's admitted in the South. The North is going to be at a political disadvantage. So you see this argument come to a head about slavery in Missouri. What you need to keep in mind, and I'll address this multiple times, is that slavery is the vehicle to maintain political power. Okay, it's not necessarily a moral argument. You don't have a lot of people or majority of the population saying slavery is bad, we can't have it. But what you do have are people clamoring to maintain their political power. So what do you see in the North? You have some people exposed to extending slavery because they felt that it was morally wrong. In a more probably realistic view, people want to maintain, those in the North want to maintain their stranglehold on Congress. They want to make sure they have more votes, particularly in the Senate, than the southern states do. And the same thing you see in the South, okay? The South looks at expanding slavery as an expansion of their God-given rights, and two, their economy. So if they can expand into new territories, they can produce more cotton, produce more tobacco, their economy will be better off. They also feared that admission of new states to the North would allow for a limit to the expansion of slavery and eventually an attack on the Southern way of life. They also wanted to preserve and expand their political power in Congress. Okay, slavery allowed them to do so. If you had slave states, you would have slave-friendly politicians in the House and the Senate, and therefore, if you have more than the northern states, your legislation and all the different things that go with that will favor the South. Okay, so in 1820, you have a solution presented by Henry Clay, who ends up being called the Great Compromiser. He's also a guy who ran for president multiple times and loses every time he runs. But the solution is rather simple. Maine would be added as a northern free state, even though they didn't meet all the requirements. At this time, they're still part of Massachusetts, so they're allowed to break away and form their own state and govern themselves. Missouri then would be admitted as a slave state. Another condition of this is they drew a line on the parallel of 36 degrees north, 36 degrees 20 minutes north, and said anything north of that line would not be slave. Anything south of that line could be slave. Okay, so the compromise is simple. Maine comes in as a free state, Missouri comes in as a slave state, and then they set a precedent for what states are going to be admitted as free or slave based on this arbitrary line, which is essentially the southern border of Missouri. So if you look at this map, Maine comes in as a free state, Missouri comes in as a slave state. You have this line right here that says it's 36 degrees 30 minutes north. Anything above this line, if they're admitted, is going to be free. Okay, so all these states up here are going to be free. Anything below the line can be slave. Now, a couple problems. Who owns the land below the line? Spain. So we don't even have that. Okay, the other thing is if you extend this line, I'm going to try to do it as straight as I can, across the United States, what you see is the fact that this line goes through multiple future states and splits them in half, from Texas to New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, California. And we don't even own this land yet. Okay, so basically what this compromise does is it ensures that all of this territory up here comes in as a free state, and any new territory down here will come in as a slave. Later on, we'll talk about an aspect called the WILMOT PROVISO, which says all land that comes in from the U.S.-Mexican War, the Mexican-American War, becomes a southern or slave state, and that basically goes against the Missouri Compromise. It does not pass. It passes the Senate, doesn't pass the House. I think I'll clean that up a little bit later. But the Wilmot Proviso fails. So what you're setting yourself up for is just a short-term solution to a long-term problem. Now, again, it's not necessarily about slavery being wrong or immoral. It's about preserving political power in the North and the South in Congress. All right, guys.